Welcome everyone to the Edith Wheeler Memorial Library. This is the fourth installment of Art Gottlieb's The Cold War, A Historical Perspective. I would like to just take a moment and thank the Friends of the Library for sponsoring this program. Now, please give a warm welcome to Art Gottlieb.
Thank you very much. How are you all today? As always, if you've got any questions or comments about anything I've already done, you can pass that along either through the chat room or, follow up with an email. I'll be happy to fill in anything I can. So today we have part 4 of a 5-part series. And I had to double check that because usually our series are like 6 parts. And we've covered quite a bit. I'm not doing this one with slides. That would be helpful in some cases because I want to cover more information and I wanted to have more of an intellectual approach about it and explain a few things more. I'm just leaving it between my mind and your mind on this one. All right, I hope I've been able to paint a good picture of the places, the events, and the personalities involved. It's quite a bit. It's quite a bit. You cannot understand the world that we live in today, certainly, without understanding this, without understanding the Cold War of the late 20th century, up until the next era that we usually start off with saying, well, the end of the official Cold War was the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then we had a peace dividend for about 10 years during the 1990s. And then, of course, we start our current age, the war on terror. And that seemed to be what we were going to be involved with for the 21st century until Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine back in the later part of February of this year. And, so it's yet to be seen what phase we're in at this point. And it's also yet to be seen if the aspirations of present-day China is going to be part of what Vladimir Putin is doing, or really just a coincidence. It's just too soon to tell. And during the time of the Cold War, it was hard to tell also to some degrees. I mean, everyone, of course, is trying to make a speculation about what actually is happening in a global sense. Is something just an isolated incident, or is it part of something larger, So here's what I've got for you today. I've got a timeline that I'm going to go down here. That's going to take us through the late 1940s, right up to the early 1960s, or the mid 1960s, as it were. I want to talk about the Berlin airlift. I want to talk about the rise of thermonuclear weapons as a matter of technology. And then the strategic defense triad, which is what was referred to as strategic air command, so that we had these bombers flying around at all times, ready to drop nuclear weapons as a deterrence. And then in 1960, the United States developed the ability to launch missiles from underwater, from a submerged submarine, which then became what is probably the most long-lasting part of our strategic defense initiative, which is underwater missiles that can actually launch some retaliatory or defensive strike anywhere in the world from an unseen submarine. Okay, and these things have all nuclear weapons on them now, of course. And then, of course, land-based missile silos, which I don't think that there were many of them around here in our part of the country, but there were, but most of them out on flat plains, etc. So Russia was filled with these things, and so were we. And also, I'm going to be talking about the Korean War. I'm going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall, of course, the beginnings of Vietnam, and well, I don't know if I'm going to get to the legacy of Vietnam here. And, that's a lot. That's quite a bit. So we'll start off with the Berlin airlift. Now, as I've mentioned, at the end of World War II, the Germany was divided into different occupation zones, right? So you had the Russian zone, which was in the northeast of the country. And then you had the American zone, the British zone, and there was a French zone also, right? And the idea between all of this was that we, the Allies, were going to administer Germany until Germany was, like, I guess, purged of Nazis would probably be the best way to put it. And then, well, they can have their own currency, and they're ready to stand on their own and go back to being Germany without the Nazis. So that was going to be that. And that was what was decided between Roosevelt and Stalin and during those meetings, et cetera, in places like Yalta. Now, as it turns out, post facto, Stalin was not exactly forthcoming with Roosevelt. And on the same time, Roosevelt receives criticism for being naive and giving away too much to Stalin. So what happens after the war is that Russia, as I mentioned to you before, really had no intention of giving up anything it had secured during the war. And there's going to be no relinquishing of the Soviet territory in Russia, you see. So when the rest of Germany is ready to actually launch itself back into its own post-war sans Nazi Germany, Russia has a million excuses why they can't leave, and either should anybody else. So finally, the rest of Germany, which turns out to be West Germany afterwards, decides that we're not waiting anymore. We're just going to launch our own post-war country, right? And then, of course, that created the split between East Germany and West Germany, which was the map of Germany that I grew up with as a school child, right? West Germany and East Germany. And kind of like North Korea, South Korea, all legacies of the same period of time. So in East Germany, all right, or even in the occupation zone that was the Russian occupation zone, even before the country was split down the middle between West and East, there is a little island called Berlin. And Berlin is split just the way the country is split, right? So Berlin itself is a microcosm of the country at large. If you zero in with a magnifying glass and you look at Berlin, which is surrounded by the Soviet sector, Berlin itself is split into East Berlin. And the western part of Berlin is governed by or administrated by the Western Allies. Now, so this was always a precarious position, always. And the Russians knew that, Stalin knew it. And he decided to, in one of the most direct confrontations in political confrontations of the Cold War, an early example is that Stalin decides that he is going to shut off all of the land traffic leading to West Berlin. So in other words, West Berlin now is going to be essentially blockaded, right? Sometimes this is called the Berlin blockade. And what that's going to do is it's going to put the West Berlin allies, right, the English, the French, and the Americans particularly, in a situation where we're going to have to capitulate or give up West Berlin because, well, we can't get any supplies in. We can't get food in. We can't get coal or wood or medical supplies or anything, you see. And so Stalin was going to hold us essentially hostage. Now, Harry Truman, which was somebody that Stalin was really trying to size up, and figured that he was going to be a pushover because, I mean, Harry Truman wasn't even that popular in the United States after all. And this is an important sort of a thing because, I mean, Harry Truman was always trying to get out from the shadow of, you know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was like the accidental president, if you will. And people are like, well, the only reason why Harry Truman is there is because FDR died, right? And when Harry Truman is, you know, coming up to an election on his own right, Stalin decides to pull this. And this is always important to ask the question of why did something happen at this particular moment? Well, Stalin was hoping to put pressure on Truman to not want to take the political risk of having to risk war to defend West Berlin. And the question was, what is Harry Truman going to do? Is he going to back down and say, you know what, it's not worth it? Or is Harry Truman going to stand up and risk war? See? And this becomes a seminal moment. Now, to look at it in a larger sense, the United States has always had a history of fighting wars when we had to fight them. And then we literally just, as citizen army, as it were, we rolled up everything and just went home, right? Because we wanted to be civilians and not soldiers, right? If the next war comes up, well, then we'll remobilize. So by the time that 1947 rolled around, 1948, our military was a fraction of the size it was only a couple of years before. We had demobilized everything, right? We took our ships and we put them in mothballs. We took our airplanes, we put them in mothballs. We scrapped everything else. You know, all of the citizen soldiers and everything were all sent back to civilian life. And it was hard to even find people to remain in the military because, you know, the notion that you were doing it to defeat, you know, Nazism or something like that, that was all gone, right? And you could probably make better money in the private sector. You see, now these were all things that politically led Stalin to think that he could actually win this gamble. You see, this is really a very parallel situation to some of the things that are going on in our contemporary world right now, as far as why you're doing something now and why you think you're going to get away with it now. You see, it's like a 3-level chess game, you know. So as far as the United States was concerned, trying to convince the American people that we should go to World War III, which is what it would be, to defend this little speck of land called West Berlin, I mean, that's a pretty tall order, you see. But for Harry Truman, it was a matter of principle, and not just empty principle. See, to understand this, you have to understand Harry Truman and the way he saw things at that time, right? Now, before World War II started, the leader of the Western world was one Neville Chamberlain, right? He was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and all of these people at that time vividly remembered the disaster that was World War I, right? World War I was this calamitous thing, and it truly was, that could never be allowed to happen again, right? So Neville Chamberlain, his criticism in the history books is that Neville Chamberlain kept appeasing Adolf Hitler, that if he just kept giving Adolf Hitler what he wanted, which if you rationalized it enough, it was not unreasonable, right? And that's true, because if you understand the Treaty of Versailles, it was very punitive towards Germany, right? So, you know, somebody like a Neville Chamberlain was like, well, maybe we were too hard on him back in 1919, and, you know, maybe it's okay that Germany can have an air force, and maybe it's okay that Germany can have a navy, and maybe it's okay that Germany can actually totally remilitarize and take over this and take over that, right? You know, that's what we call in psychology rationalization. But Neville Chamberlain saw himself in the position as a world leader who was going to prevent World War II, right? That was, his goals were not ignoble, although history has proved him to be naive in his treatment of Adolf Hitler. So therefore, if Neville Chamberlain just kind of like keeps bending over to Hitler, then, you know, World War II has been avoided, and it would have been worth it, you see. So Harry Truman is the contemporary, as far as his position in the world, in 1946, 1947, that of Neville Chamberlain was in 1937, right? And Harry Truman is using Neville Chamberlain as a prime example of what not to do, right? So now Stalin is the Adolf Hitler, and Harry Truman is the Neville Chamberlain, and Harry Truman was not going to make the mistake of appeasement, right? So therefore, Harry Truman, if he just says, you know, well, I can't very well ask the United States to completely remobilize and possibly get into World War III for this little speck of land we're calling West Berlin, nobody's going to want to get on board with that. And that's what Stalin was hoping was going to happen. But they came up with a more creative example. What happened was that the United States mobilized every possible, with its allies, by the way, were mobilized every possible airplane it could find. And instead of using a land route to get into West Berlin, I'm sorry, we just flew over the obstacles and kept landing into West Berlin. And, you know, this became the famous Berlin airlift, you see. So basically what we did was we defied Stalin, and we flew in tons and tons and tons of stuff. And we had to be very, very careful that it was never going to be confused with anything of a military value. You see, we used civilian transport aircraft or military transport aircraft, which were non-weapon carrying, you know, like C-54s and that sort of a thing. And flour, milk, medical supplies, things like that. You see, sugar, and it was all widely publicized as such. You know, because if you took the chance and you were actually bringing in, you know, cases of dynamite or bullets or something, then the Russians might have the excuse to actually shoot down one of our airplanes, you see. So it was this incredible airlift mission, and which has never been duplicated. And then within a year's time, we had more stuff going into West Berlin than was the case before the whole blockade started. And it was a humiliation for Stalin, because he had abjectly failed in his goal to isolate and cause the West to let go of West Berlin. And so Stalin lost this gamble. And this was a big, big challenge. One of the first real, you know, eye to eye, who's going to blink first moments in the post-war world, post-World War II world, as far as the Cold War is concerned. This could have escalated by any miscalculation into God knows what. And it also bolstered Harry Truman, by the way. Now, in the late 1940s, even after this, we have one other thing I want to add to my list here that I didn't mention just a moment ago, which was China. Right now, before World War II, China was already in its own civil war. And you had the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong, right? And you had the Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek. And of course, we were supporting the nationalists. But what happened was the nationalists lost, right? And Mao Zedong, after World War II was over, was able to essentially rally his forces under communism and drive the Chinese nationalists out of mainland China onto an island called Formosa, otherwise known to us as Taiwan, right? And obviously, Taiwan is still in the news. You know, so the legacy is always that Taiwan was this place where we wanted to defend because our allies from World War II, Chiang Kai-shek was there on Taiwan, and this was to have another long legacy. I mean, we could do an entire program just on this. So the point here is that Mao Zedong declares a new country, right, under communism. We referred to as Red China, of course. And this was a real black eye for Harry Truman, because people said, oh, well, Harry Truman let China go to the communists, right? That's the kind of feeling it was, I mean, politics is politics, so Harry Truman is the president when this happens, then it's Harry Truman's fault that one of the largest, most populous countries in the world goes communist, right? So if you're a Republican, you're looking to make hay out of that and say that Harry Truman failed in this regard, right? And that's just the way American politics runs. So anyway, so you have this entire part of the world now that is completely communist. You add the landmass of China to the landmass of Russia, or the USSR, better put. And I mean, that's like a pretty big part of the world that's communist now, right? Now, remember, from an overall perspective, we're still working on the overall premise that the purpose of communism is to ensure the ultimate takeover of the entire world into a one government socialist state, right? So every time another country, especially a major country, went communist, it was it amounted to being one step closer to our own demise, right? Because there was no question about the United States being a socialist state back in those days. We had a high percentage of our population that was church going, et cetera. And, we were, despite Roosevelt and the New Deal, et cetera, and many of the alphabet agencies that were created during that period of time, the United States still considered itself to be an entrepreneurial, market-based capitalist place where God was the primary reason for our existence, see? Whereas a socialist state would be practically the opposite, certainly a communist state, you see? But if the entire world were to become socialist/communist, then the United States would eventually become isolated and we would be standing alone. So everything that we tried to resist while it was happening via the Truman Doctrine, while we said we were protecting other countries, but really we were protecting ourselves as well, hence the investment, we to save ourselves, we had to stop communism from encroaching across the entire globe, where we would be maybe the last to go, but certainly would be going, right? Now, we have a situation where Korea is split down the 38th parallel, right? That was at the end of World War II, as I described, and Russia had declared war on Japan right after we dropped the first atomic bomb. It still seemed like we might need Russia for the invasion of mainland Japan, and certainly we would need all hands on deck for that. But when Japan surrendered under the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, then we didn't want Russia anywhere near Japan, or anybody else for that matter. I mean, our closest ally, ideologically were the British, but in the Pacific, there is no way that the United States was going to allow Japan to be divided up in the form that Germany was. It was not going to happen. This one was ours, right? It was Japan that attacked the United States on December 7th, 1941. And this one, you might say, was personal for us, okay? And So we, as a SOP, we let the Soviets, administer the upper half of the Korean Peninsula, which hadn't been a country since the Japanese took it over in 1905, and Japan had essentially annexed Korea at that point. So Korea became one of these nations that was going to be a burgeoning country in its own right in the post-World War II era, like so many others in Africa and other places that had been colonized for a very, very long time, right? Now, since Korea didn't have its own, government that was ready to go, that had only been interrupted by World War II, like Germany, Korea needed to be literally administered by somebody, so the Russians got the top half of the place and the Americans got the south half of the place, right? In other words, south of the 38th parallel, north of the 38th parallel. Now, naturally, the Russians put in a government that reflected their own way of doing things, communism. And the Americans put in a government that reflected our ways of doing things, right? Below the 38th parallel, which is actually how it remains right now, of course. But timing is very important. Timing is very important. In 1949, the United States puts out publicly our defense strategy in the Western Pacific. And if you look at the line of demarcation about what was considered a primary thing for us to defend, and by definition, anything on the other side of that line wasn't important for us to defend, the line went in between Korea, right, offshore of Korea, right, with everything on the eastern part of that line being things that were important to us. Japan, Okinawa, the Philippines, right? And Korea was on the other side of this line. I mean, we literally put that together and published it. So anybody looking at it could only infer that, well, I guess Korea is not something that the United States seems like it's worth going to war over. Well, what do you know? Right after that, the North Koreans, in consultation with the Chinese communists and from Moscow, gets the okay to roll the dice and invade over the 38th parallel into South Korea. Boom, you've got the beginning of the Korean War in 1950, see? And the question is, well, I don't know, is the United States going to mobilize its armed forces? Are the NATO countries going to mobilize its forces? Who's going to go to war over this? With nuclear weapons, by the way, you see, is it worth it? Right? The only difference between this and the Berlin thing was that the Berlin thing, the Soviets didn't have a nuclear weapon. Now they have nuclear weapons, you see, and it's a bigger place. So the question always becomes is if you let this go and you don't make a big deal about it, well, then it's going to give somebody the green light to go ahead and keep doing it, right? See, that's what we call the domino theory, right? So it became very, very important to protect South Korea. Now, the United States doesn't want to go unilaterally into this war. We don't have to, because now we have something that was put in place called the United Nations, right? Now, the difference between the United Nations and the organization that preceded it in the wake of World War I, the League of Nations, the difference is that the United Nations has the ability to deter such aggressive acts, which was a complaint about the League of Nations, right? Which obviously didn't serve its purpose, which was to prevent another world war, right? So the idea of the United Nations was to pick up and make correct what the League of Nations failed to do in preventing the next global confrontation. So the meeting of the United Nations Security Council ensues, right? The permanent members of the Security Council And it is voted on that since the North Koreans had invaded a sovereign territory, South Korea, that they were in fact in violation of the United Nations Charter, and therefore the Security Council approved a military action, a coalition force, to go and push the North Koreans back over the 38th parallel from which they had come, right? That's the mandate. Now, the question is, well, since Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, well, why didn't Russia just veto it, right? Because obviously Russia is on the side of the North Koreans. Well, the answer is that Russia wasn't there. Russia was boycotting the United Nations because the Americans primarily refused to recognize the new government of Red China, right? We didn't recognize it. And Russia, being the avuncular communist country, found that outrageous, and they said, we're walking out. So the Russians weren't there because we had boycotted, or not boycotted, but didn't recognize the Chinese communists as the legitimate government of China. You see, so it's almost by literal accident that we were able to actually approve a coalition force to go into Korea to drive the North Koreans out of there. You see, this is like an interesting point, I think. Now, Douglas MacArthur is essentially the ruler of Japan since 1945. You know, he puts together a constitution, completely revamps Japan in what's going to be a model, sort of a quasi-democratic country in a Western style, and that is never going to be militarized again. And so the first person to put in charge of the coalition forces is somebody who is lionized as the expert in all things Asian, and that is Douglas MacArthur. Now, Douglas MacArthur is somebody who has achieved this kind of like this storied status. I mean, if you ask Douglas MacArthur or people who supported Douglas MacArthur, I mean, he won World War II by himself, and the Navy was just there to drive him around in between islands. Douglas MacArthur hadn't been to the United States since before World War II, so he wasn't around, and he just had this mythical kind of a status. Now, it should also be noted that the Republicans in the United States were grooming Douglas MacArthur to run as the next Republican president that was going to be the one who was going to oust one Harry Truman, see? And because after all, the Republicans hadn't been in the White House since Herbert Hoover lost his election, right, in 1932. So that's a long time, right? Remember, FDR had 4 terms, died in the beginning of his 4th term. Harry Truman's been there ever since. And so there you have it. Now, Douglas MacArthur has his own agenda in Korea, right? He takes charge of the coalition forces, right? And this is a whole story by itself, of course. But the United Nations Security Council mandate is to drive the North Koreans back over the 38th parallel. MacArthur has a completely different idea. You see, the thing is, MacArthur, I mean, in his defense, MacArthur is the first general put in a position now, American general, or any general actually, where he has to fight something called a limited war, right? For Douglas MacArthur, there is no such thing as a limited war. If you're going to apply American force, if you're going to ask young American men and women to die, then the only explanation is that we are there for ultimate victory. right? It's a very binary thing. We're either there doing it to win or we're not there doing it, right? Now, Harry Truman is well aware of the fact that the Soviet Union has nuclear weapons, which they will presumably give to the Chinese or use on behalf of the Chinese, who may in fact use it on behalf of the North Koreans. Remember, the thing is that we saw all communism to be part of the same family, right? So therefore, if one communist nation was going to do something, that all of the communist nations must be behind it, right? And therefore, if we're going to challenge one communist nation, then all of the other communist nations are going to defend that communist nation. That's the way we saw it. We didn't really distinguish North Korea, China, Russia. We saw it as one block that must be operating in complete dovetailed fashion. And that was to come to its most egregious mistake in the next war coming up, Vietnam, you see. Now, as it turns out, I mean, North Korea wanted to do what North Korea wanted to do. And even though it had a wink and a nod from its two bigger brother communist countries, China and Russia, you know, the Chinese and the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans did not agree on everything at all, you see. We saw it all, though, as one seamless block, right? So Harry Truman is looking at this war now, which is, of course, referred to euphemistically as a police action, right? Because the mandate says that the only thing we're there to do is to push the North Koreans back over the 38th parallel, right? But MacArthur's there, and he has a different idea. He's going to push the North Koreans all the way back up to where he did, up to practically the border between North Korea and China, called the Yalu River, and which he knew, because we had the intelligence to prove it, was going to spark a counter attack by the Chinese over into North Korea, right? Because now we are putting China as a threat, because we are now right up against the border of China, right? And the Chinese warned us about that too. They said, if you get anywhere near here, we're going to attack, right? And then you're going to be at war with us. And that's exactly what happened, right? And then the Chinese fled over the Chinese border into North Korea and essentially drive all of the allies all the way back down from whence we had come. You know, so we're paying for the same territory 2-3 times, you see? And then it finally reaches a stalemate down south of the 38th parallel, right? So what MacArthur wanted to do was, he was actually, it wouldn't be a problem for him if we wound up in a general war with the communist Chinese, you see? And his goal was to eradicate communism in China, because one of the closest relationships that MacArthur had during World War II was with Chiang Kai-shek, who had been driven off of the Chinese mainland by Mao Zedong's forces, you see? So MacArthur was literally using the Korean War to finish some unfinished business, right, that he had, because his buddy got driven offshore to Formosa, you see, and MacArthur wanted the Chinese nationalists to be in charge of China. And he thought that, well, we're going to be at war with the Chinese or the communists anyway, you know, now's a good time to do it. The United States has, at least on paper, a military advantage, etc. You see, now, Truman wanted a limited war. He wanted just to keep this to Korea and deal with the Korea thing and not be in general war with the Chinese, and certainly not the Russians, you see, because then it would become a World War III. It would be a global war, because we've already got a tinder, a barrel of dynamite ready to be exploded in the form of Germany, The United States has a lot of garrison forces in Germany, and still do, by the way. And so for Truman, this is going to turn into a general war if we're not careful. As a matter of fact, during the Korean War, we had to remobilize our armed forces, right? We were pulling ships out of mothballs by the dozens, right? Because essentially we had stored our Navy and our aircraft, and we were literally recommissioning everything as fast as we possibly could, because we thought that the Korean War, right, or the police action, if you will, it was going to be something that was practically a trigger point for a larger global conflict. And we sent more stuff actually to the Mediterranean to support Central Europe than we did actually to the Pacific for the Korean War, right? We thought that this was going to be a global thing, that Korea was going to distract us, and then we were going to get all involved with Korea. And then meanwhile, the Soviet Union was going to use that opportunity to break out from Eastern Germany and overwhelm our forces in Western Germany, and probably a repeat of what was done by the Germans in World War I and World War II, fly all the way to France and then the English Channel. That was the scenario in the Korean War. Of course, that didn't happen. In 1953, well, before 1953, what happens is that, of course, MacArthur is, too much has gone to his head. Not to say that the guy's not a genius and he's not a competent person to lead troops or anything like that. I'm not saying that. What happened was that MacArthur forgot who he was working for. MacArthur had been literally the president of his own country for the last 5 years, Japan. He had his own press corps. He did what he wanted to. I mean, he was the king, and not only that. Remember, I told you that the Republicans were grooming him to be the next Republican candidate. He saw himself, MacArthur, as not working for Harry Truman, but literally better than Harry Truman. And his attitude and his press releases showed it. And he's sending out these press releases, MacArthur is, that are highly critical of the Truman administration's foreign policy. And Harry Truman fires him for insubordination. So the Truman presidency is over. The Republicans get their general, right, in the form of one Dwight David Eisenhower, right? So in 1953, you've got a new administration coming in. You've got Eisenhower coming in. And another thing that happened simultaneously, almost simultaneously, was that Stalin dies, you see? So it's literally the beginning of a new era. And the new era is that Eisenhower doesn't want this Korea thing on his plate. And then after a power struggle, the next person in charge over in the Soviet Union is Nikita Khrushchev. And Nikita Khrushchev wants to bring a new era in and make Soviet politics more popular. He wants to be able to persuade the world that, unlike Stalin, who just, if you didn't agree with him, you just disappeared one day, okay? Khrushchev wanted to actually prove to everybody that that communism was literally a better system of governance and ideology and finance than capitalism was, right? So we're going to show everybody that actually we're just better. And he wanted to kind of make the Soviet Union more transparent. Not that it was transparent, but compared to Stalin, it was more transparent. So as a goodwill gesture, Khrushchev didn't want this headache of Korea either being associated with communism, you see? Because after all, they didn't really have the high moral ground, because North Korea undisputably invaded South Korea unprovoked, right? So Khrushchev put pressure on the North Koreans to go to the bargaining table, right? And then, of course, that's a story by itself. But the war ends not in a diplomatic treaty, which is what you need to end a war. Is the war is ceased in the form of an armistice, which is really nothing more than a ceasefire. And that is exactly where we have it today. Now, if you were to ask, the leader of North Korea today, he would still consider himself to be at war with the United States. See? So as far as the North Koreans are concerned, even though we've forgotten about it a long time ago, they still see themselves to be actively at war with us and still just engaged in a kind of a ceasefire, right? So that's the Korean War, right? And this is really a proxy war between what? Between the West and communism. It's a proxy war. Now, the United States is not completely a proxy war because even though the South Koreans were fighting alongside of us, the United States was directly involved, but it's a proxy war. It's the United States fighting the Soviet Union, right? Under the guise of South Korea fighting North Korea, right? That's what a proxy war is. Excuse me. So this sets the stage, right, for the next big proxy war, which is obviously Vietnam, you see? And one of the things that made Vietnam at least palatable at the onset was that it's like, well, we didn't win in Korea, but we didn't lose either. And the most important thing was achieved was via the Truman Doctrine, we had stopped the spread of communism, right? The North Koreans, which had sought to take the entire peninsula of Korea, but we stopped them from doing it, right? So Vietnam was kind of like a parallel situation, you see? You had North Vietnam, you had South Vietnam, right? And the North Vietnamese wanted South Vietnam. So how is that different than what just happened over here, you see? And if it was justified to lose like 50,000 guys over fighting the expansion of communism on the Korean peninsula, how is it any less noble to do the same thing in the support of South Vietnam? You see? That made perfect sense back then. 1961, we have another massive event that occurs that defines the West versus the East, and that is the ultimate tension of what's going on in Europe is manifested once again in the place called Berlin, right? Because you've got this fishbowl of Berlin, like I said to you, still divided right down the middle, right, with the Western powers and the Soviet powers. And there's a tremendous difference between what's going on in the recovering post-war, the Western part of Europe, versus what's happening essentially at the delineation point of the Iron Curtain and to the east, right? And this is the same thing, of course, in Berlin, because Berlin's a microcosm of what I just described. As I mentioned to you last time, the money that was coming in via the Marshall Plan, right, was Stalin forbade the countries that were behind the Berlin Wall from taking $1 of Western money. It was a bit of nonsense. He's like, well, you're independent countries, Stalin said. Obviously, they weren't. And they were completely under Stalin's thumb. But he said, oh, go ahead and take money from the West if you want to, but, we are going to completely cut you off from absolutely everything else. And of course, Stalin would have crushed them, It would have been extremely punitive. He forbade anybody from taking money from the United States, you see. And what was happening was that by 1961, which is like 16 years after the war's over, you had a situation where people had relatives that lived in, I don't know, West Germany, for instance, and they were prospering, right? World War II was way behind them in the background, and they lived in a new apartment building, and they were becoming prosperous, and all of these things that were happening. And your cousin, who lives still over someplace in East Germany, it was like going from color to black and white. And it was like they were still suffering the privations of an immediate post-World War II Germany, right? And you went over to East Germany, and they still had these big piles of bricks and debris and all the rest of that, as if World War II had only ended a month ago, right? So you couldn't convince, even with the propaganda machine that the Soviets had, you couldn't convince your own people to believe something that betrayed what your own eyes saw, which was that under Western countries, there was prosperity, and under communism, we're living in this kind of this terrible way. And people want to move from the East to the West. And this was becoming more and more critical in a place like Berlin, because the Russians wanted to turn Berlin, East Berlin, into a showplace to show how well communism was doing. Meanwhile, if that was the case, why did so many East Berliners try to get the hell out of there and defect to the West? And so the Russians, in exasperation, came down and forced the East Germans with Russian engineers to build this hideous looking wall straight down Berlin. They're just sawing the place in half. And it was the first wall ever, the only wall ever, I think, where it wasn't to keep other people out. It was to keep your own people from leaving. And that was the Berlin Wall. It became this incredible visual symbol of the deprivations of communism. I mean, how bad does it have to be if you got to build a wall, right, to actually keep your own people from running at the risk of being shot? And you would be shot if you got caught trying to, overcome that obstacle. You see? And that was a pretty big deal, the Berlin Wall. And then they replaced it, of course, with a more permanent one. You see, so there was no more single example worldwide than this Berlin Wall. I mean, it was something you could see. It was tangible. It was the Russians and the Germans, the East Germans, right, which were pretty much hardcore communists, by the way, the East Germans, compared to some of the other satellite states. They had the Stasi, and they had which was a worse version of the KGB, real cloak and dagger James Bond stuff, right? And if you've ever watched movies about that stuff, I mean, being the age that I am, I mean, that was the period of time where all that cloak and dagger stuff was going on. And I was watching James Bond, and it was all about, these evil people. And it was all just a metaphor for the Cold War, of course. So that's the Berlin Wall. Now, another thing that was going on right at the same period of time, right? 1960, 1961, right? Actually, between 1959 and 1961, was right under our nose in the Isle of Cuba, right? What is that? 89 nautical miles from Key West, if I got that right. And so that is about as under your nose as you can get as far as we're concerned. Now, the United States has always been a little bit spoiled in the sense that we've had these two massive oceans separating us from whatever turmoil was going on in, Asia, and whatever turmoil was going on in Europe. And not so anymore. Our adversary, our primary adversary, has now lodged itself right under our nostrils. right? Now, if you're looking at this from a larger sense, it's kind of like as far as the Cubans were concerned, or at least Fidel Castro was concerned, and as far as Khrushchev was concerned, well, it was kind of like, well, how do you like them apples? Because the United States had always been such a dominant force in Europe since the end of World War II that we had all of these missiles, pretty much pointed right at Russia, you see? And now the Russians have used the animosity of Central America um, against us, right? And it was a brilliant move as far as their politics were concerned. And Fidel Castro, we saw Fidel Castro not as such a bad person, because he was, replacing Batista, which was no saint either, you see. But Fidel Castro had made himself seem like, in today's euphemisms, a moderate of sorts, you see, a reformer, right? And it wasn't until that Fidel Castro really seized power that he outed himself as a full-blown Soviet communist, you see. And then it was a little too little, a little too late. And, there was a lot of this animosity that existed, and I might add still exists in Central and South America towards the United States. Ever since the Monroe Doctrine of 1820, the United States had been a kind of justified by its own rationalization about doing whatever it wanted to in the Americas, right? North America, South America. The Monroe Doctrine, 1820, pretty ballsy, really, because the United States was only like basically a country for about 50 years. And then here we are telling all of the European powers that have been around hundreds and hundreds of years to stay the hell out of this entire hemisphere, right? If anything goes on here politically or militarily, it's going to be the business of the United States, whether it's in South America, Central America, North America, including Canada. Thank you very much, right? That's pretty heady stuff. And we had always enjoyed that sort of, shall I say, hegemonic power by assumption, right? And this was something that challenged all of that. I mean, the Soviet Union, completely by surprise, right under our nose, had actually gained a foothold right in the Caribbean. And that was something, of course, that couldn't be tolerated, right? And this happened, now the CIA had its hands on this, right, during the latter part of the Eisenhower administration, right? So now we're going to use covert operations, right, to, I don't know, make Fidel Castro have a bad accident or something, if you know what I mean, right? That was what the CIA was going to do. And there's a long list of these things, by the way. We can have a whole program about the United States involvement in other countries' politics. And if it's if it's something that's going to stop communism from metastasizing, then whatever you do is worth it. You see, that's the rationalization on this. Certainly when it's right under our nose, right? And that certainly was the case here. So we launched something that actually John F. Kennedy inherits when he takes the office of the presidency, which is come to known as the Bay of Pigs operation, right? Which is a big black eye, of course, to the United States because the whole thing got botched, right? And it emboldened the Cubans, it emboldened Khrushchev, it made John F. Kennedy look like a greenhorn, and it was bad news, right? So then we've got this U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba, and it takes pictures of, well, what are obviously the Soviet missile sites being built all over Cuba. You see, and this ushers in something called the Cuban Missile Crisis. And John F. Kennedy now is, he's got to kind of like, this is our eyeball to eyeball moment with the Soviet Union, right? And this is a whole story by itself. I can do an entire hour and a half lecture on this and would be glad to do so. So this is now like probably the closest that we actually came to a nuclear exchange, right? Because anybody who would have just sort of mistakenly pulled the trigger here could have easily fired the first shot, which would have probably resulted in us retaliating or they're retaliating, leading to God knows what, you see? And it's kind of a miracle that nobody actually put their finger on the trigger, because people's fingers were ready to go. The level of potentiality for miscommunication here was off the chart. If I told you about it, you'd be more scared about this than you even were. The Cuban Missile Crisis actually turned out to be a success for the United States, because as far as the world was concerned, we had called the bluff of the aggressor Khrushchev and forced him to back down, right? And as it turns out, we had actually, on paper at least, made equal concessions in Europe. You know, behind the scenes, we had made a deal that wasn't publicized, that we were, if the Soviets got rid of their missiles in a verifiable way, and their aircraft, by the way, out of Cuba, we promised we would never invade Cuba. And number two, we were going to remove our Jupiter missile batteries in places like Eastern Poland, et cetera, that were under the Soviets' nostrils, you see? So it seemed like an equitable deal, right? What we didn't tell them was we were going to take away our missile batteries from Eastern Poland anyway, because they were obsolete. And we had better missiles that we had already developed, which could fire further from the West to do the same job, right? So if, you know, for tit for tat, we sort of like scam them a little bit, but it doesn't matter. It seemed like the United States had met the challenge and forced the Soviets to back down, you know? But remember, this is right in our backyard in the Caribbean, right? You could say that the same sort of thing, use this as an analogy, if you will, to say that, you know, the way that we were able to handle what happened in Cuba would be kind of like, would think about the advantage that, I don't know, China would have if something was going on in the Taiwan Strait. You see, I mean, it's like right there. It's right there next to them. You see, they have a natural advantage. It's their home court, right? They have the resources, they have the logistics. It's right there. I mean, we would have to go halfway around the world to do that, or actually come out of Japan at least. And but you see my point. You know, and the Soviet Union was in the same exact spot here, you know, having to go all the hell the way over here to the Caribbean. It's also another interesting point would be to look at the foreign policy of the current China and see that the Chinese have picked up the same strategy that the Soviets had during the Cold War in their Belt and Road Initiative to actually get all of these other countries in Central America, South America, Africa, right, to be client states of China, so that China actually will have whatever it needs as far as raw materials from those countries, and also have the capability of basing military assets there also. It's really a direct parallel to what happened during the 1950s and the 1960s to literally what's happening right at this moment with China. No difference whatsoever, and for the same purpose. So then, of course, we go from the Cuban Missile Crisis directly to Vietnam, right? Now, Vietnam is lost from the French to the North Vietnamese 1954, right? And their France's last battle there, Bien Dien Phu, right? And it's only a matter of time before North Vietnam now is going to be empowered enough to just go in the absence of France, right? And actually go down and take the rest of Vietnam. So then that becomes that parallel that I was telling you between what we did in Korea to what we ought to do in Vietnam, because it seems really quite analogous, you see. Now, as it turns out, the Vietnamese were in a war for their own nationhood, right? And they, as a matter of fact, the United States Declaration of Independence was used in all of this because, as far as Ho Chi Minh was concerned, I mean, I don't know, he was George Washington, right? And he used the United States as a Western model for how to liberate itself in a Declaration of Independence from a long list of colonial oppressors, right? Whereas the United States was trying to get out from under the colonial oppressor of Great Britain in 1775, then Ho Chi Minh now is going to get out from under the colonial oppressors of France and then Japan. You see, the problem with us and all of this was that Ho Chi Minh was a 110% communist. And so therefore we made no distinction between him and any other communist, or North Vietnam and any other communist country. If you're a communist, you're a communist. If you are a communist and you want to take over the rest of your nation, it's communist aggression. I mean, and that is it, period. You see? And our stated goal is to avoid that series of dominoes for falling, right? And so therefore, it became the same justification to prevent North Vietnam from taking over South Vietnam as it was anywhere else that we were doing since the Truman Doctrine was developed. Now, there's a lot more to this. Excuse me for my cough. There's a lot more to this. We actually did an entire program on Vietnam, if you were around for that one. So I get into a lot of the minutia about, the people that we put in charge and the puppets and the people who were not good governors in South Vietnam. The reason why they were working for us, the reason why we were trying to support them. Now, JFK stuffs a bunch of advisors into South Vietnam, a lot of them, right? Now, advisors, we get into this new kind of lexicon of terminology that is still with us today. And the big difference between Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy is Eisenhower was going to use the American strategic triad, right? The bombers, the land-based missile silos that we had with nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles, and of course our extensive submarine fleet, to serve as an offensive threat to other countries and as a defensive disinhibitor to anybody who should attack us, right? And he was going to solve things with nuclear weapons. Eisenhower was, right? It was going to be a nuclear exchange. It was going to be whatever it was. Now, John F. Kennedy considered himself to be a new kind of animal, right? It was a lot made that he was young. He was the first president born in this century, right? And he was going to surround himself with a bunch of intellectuals, and they were going to, from the Oval Office, essentially run all of the United States foreign policy, right? And he had a disdain towards the military for a number of reasons also, okay? Even though he was a military veteran himself, right? And you had the beginning of kind of like I'm going to be careful with my terminology, sort of like this intellectual elite, right? That, in other words, because we're so damn smart and we're educated, everything that happened before us is an interesting story, but we're in a different era now, right? We're in modern times, you see? And so therefore, we're going to think about this, and we're not going to make the same mistakes that people came before us made, because we're essentially like, we know more, our technology's better, and we're smarter, you see? So you add the John F. Kennedy, you add the Robert F. Kennedy, you add the Robert McNamara's, right? And it was like this dream team of young, very confident intellectuals, right? And the military was seen as these warmongering people who would do anything to start a war, so they could justify their own existence, right? Which wasn't really fair, but part of it was partially true also. If you were to ask Curtis LeMay, like during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the answer would be like, well, let's bomb them into the Stone Age, that sort of a thing, right? And John F. Kennedy wanted to take a new approach. And John F. Kennedy saw the world really as a younger person, and the embodiment of what Harry Truman had envisioned at the end of World War II as having this global community, right? So you had the Peace Corps, you had all of these things. And John F. Kennedy wanted to use where it needed to be. He wanted to use military force to be with covert forces, right? So John F. Kennedy created what was to be known as the SEALs, right? The Navy SEALs. The CIA was involved in everything, right? So you had all of this stuff going on all over the place. And he didn't want to have to fly over somebody and drop an atomic bomb on them. Not to say that I guess he would have if he had to, right? He wanted to nurture things from behind the scenes, right? So what JFK did was he stuffed South Vietnam full of American military advisors, air quotes, advisors. So now you got troops on the ground, right, that are there with loaded weapons, who are in war zones with the South Vietnamese, and we're teaching them how to fight. But we got to be careful on the terminology, because you don't want to say that we have troops on the ground, because if you have troops on the ground, well, doesn't that mean that we're at war with the North Koreans? So you don't want to say that we're at war with the North Koreans. So you can't. You only have to say that we have advisors there, which kind of like changes the terminology to the point where we're not really at war with them. We're just advising the South Vietnamese, right? And we had tons of stuff there. I mean, we were sending helicopters and equipment and guns and bullets and food and medical supplies and money and propping up the government and everything else like that. No, John F. Kennedy gets assassinated. So it is a matter of speculation to think about what would have happened in Vietnam had JFK still been alive. Okay, that's just a matter of speculation. There's books written about it, but the guy died, and there's no way of actually knowing. And so Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was not part of the dream team, by the way, right? The only reason that LBJ was there was because John F. Kennedy needed Lyndon Baines Johnson. He needed this white old guy from the South, a Dixiecrat, or else he wouldn't have been able to be elected as a Catholic. You see, so it was a political decision to bring LBJ in as the VP, you see. And had it not been for that, he probably never would have been. There's questions about how close that was anyway, that election, as we talk about seemingly all the time now. But LBJ was now the president, right? And he was going to do essentially what Harry Truman did by saying, well, the president who just died was so popular that I am not going to change anything. We're keeping all the same people, we're keeping all the same policies, and we're moving forward, right? Because LBJ was quite sure that he was not as popular a figure as John F. Kennedy was. You see, now the thing is that LBJ had his own agenda. And LBJ wanted to make himself into the 1960s version of his hero, which was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? Which really wasn't that far before that at that point. And the president before that inspired FDR was President Wilson. You see, so Lyndon Baines Johnson was going to be the next great president in the progressive tradition of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, right? And that was going to be that he was going to create this great society, And he, of course, as you know, we had all of these programs passed in the 1960s, and it was Lyndon Baines John's Great Society. That's really what he cared about. That's what he wanted his legacy to be. As far as Vietnam and the Cold War is concerned, Lyndon Baines Johnson escalated all of the advisors and everything we were doing in South Vietnam. Not that he cared about South Vietnam. If the polling showed that our policy of supporting the South Vietnamese against the aggressive North Vietnamese, similarly to what happened in Korea, it was the American people supported it. It was a popular thing. So Lyndon Baines John used that to say, I'm 100% behind this, because then Lyndon Baines Johnson got painted with the support that came with his support of the Vietnam War. And then he was going to use that political capital to push his domestic agenda. And that's exactly what it was for, and that's exactly why he did it. Now, as you know, the Vietnam War overtook Lyndon Baines Johnson, and LBJ had to show, the Asians call this saving face. And in 1964, we had this thing called the Tonkin Gulf incident, which I have an entire program on, by the way. I'm not going to tell you all the details here. But Lyndon Baines Johnson had to show the world the indignation of the United States of America of having been what he claimed was being attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats unprovoked. And then, so therefore, we were essentially going to launch these retaliatory strikes into North Vietnam, et cetera. And then the American Congress, because this whole thing seemed so justified and so popular at the time, remember, all these people are politicians, decided to get behind Lyndon Baines Johnson and essentially write him a blank check, right? Because Congress is in charge of the purse strings on such things. And they turned around, especially when it comes to wars, and they turned around and they created something called the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, right? And the Tonkin Gulf resolution gave Lyndon Baines Johnson carte blanche to escalate the war, essentially without oversight, right? He could authorize more troops by the hundreds of thousands. He could authorize the Air Force. He could authorize the Navy, right? And the Congress was just going to fund it, whatever it was. I say. And so that gave Lyndon Baines Johnson the opportunity to do something called incrementally escalate, until we had 500,000 troops there and more, right? Until we got up to like 1967, 1968, right? And then, of course, the tides of war here in the United States completely turned because public support was lost for it, right? And then Lyndon Baines Johnson is consumed by this and decides that he isn't even going to run for another term as president of the United States. I mean, it's tragedy. It's Lyndon Baines Johnson becomes a tragic figure. And the war essentially just ate him alive. So he was in a situation that Harry Truman found himself in back in like 1951, you see. And that was that we want to have a limited war, right? We want to have a limited war. Now, it wasn't like if we had beat the hell out of North Vietnam that the Soviet Union would have come and declared war on us. What happened was that the dream team in the White House, right, which was now run by Robert McNamara, et cetera, they literally micromanaged every single thing. And it became very, very confused about what we were there to do. I mean, what is the definition of an exit strategy? What is the definition of victory at this point? What are we there to do? And essentially, we were just incrementally putting more and more pressure in, and more funds, and more troops, and more money, and more equipment, on the thought that somehow the North Vietnamese would do what we hoped that they would do, which was say, oh, this is just too much, and give up, you see. Of course, they were never going to do that, because they had the will to fight, because it was a war of their own independence. And we had completely misjudged all of that. So essentially, we sought peace, right? Which was the ushering in of Richard Nixon, et cetera, the Paris Peace Accords, and that whole thing was over by 1972, 1973, right? And then Congress completely defunded the whole thing immediately afterwards. They just completely defunded it because it lost its popularity, you see? So when it was politically expedient to be popular, Congress funded it infinitely. And when it became a political liability, Congress literally chopped the legs off of the South Vietnamese, which we left there alone, and we promised to support, and we cut off all their funding. And as soon as that happened in 1974, the North Vietnamese had no further impediments. They just came down and they took over the rest of the country. And then, of course, you have the evacuation of the, who's left, the loyalists to the United States, on the roofs of the embassy, Saigon embassy, et cetera. And that's the end of it. And all of those scenes of people flying off of all those buildings, et cetera. I mean, that happened. I was 2 weeks away from graduation from high school at that point. So, and that was that. That was the end of the Vietnam War. And that lasted that way. That was a big black eye for the United States, of course. And that was something that in our evacuation, or whatever you want to call it, from Afghanistan, those images were parallel back to what was, if you're a critic of the Biden administration, you would say, well, this was now what just happened was equally as humiliating as what happened in 1975. So, but the Cold War at this point, the fact that the Soviets had such a large nuclear arsenal, and that we had such a large nuclear arsenal all through this period of time, led to this thing called MAD, right? An acronym, if you will, mutually assured destruction, right? So the thought is that a local war, another proxy war, was the only thing you could fight. You see, it's got to be limited in scope. It's got to be in some other place. It can't be between the United States and Russia, because the United States and Russia would mean the end of the end of civilization, right? Because as soon as you start using nuclear weapons, well, that's the end of it. I mean, it's mutually assured destruction. It's mad, and it is mad. So we have this thing finally. It's the first doomsday weapon, nuclear weapons, finally, that did prevent some of the, you might say, carelessness that led to things like World War I, right? And I would say that we're in the same sort of a situation now. I mean, if we're looking at what's some of the rhetoric going on from Russia and all the rest of that today, which you could actually, in a way, say that it's kind of like the way that we had the Cold War without the communism itself. You see what I mean? So what's the difference? I mean, Vladimir Putin is kind of a Stalin-esque character, right? But the biggest global threat we face at the moment, of course, is perceived to be China. I'm talking about these submarines that have nuclear weapons on them and all the rest of that stuff. I mean, many countries have those today. They're all over the place. I mean, we've got, I would like to think the best fleet of them. But the Indians have their own fleet of them, right? Certainly the Soviet Union has their own fleet of them. The Chinese have their own fleet of them. So the notion that somebody's going to launch some nuclear weapon and it's going to have some effect is almost irrelevant, because a retaliation could come overwhelmingly in any form, unexpectedly, from an underwater platform that is virtually undetectable. And that is a situation that has existed since literally the 1960s, right? In the 1950s into the 1960s, the Soviets had so thoroughly carved into our technology institutions that they were essentially able to copy anything that we would develop in a short amount of time. So that means that if we created a bigger nuclear weapon, it was just a matter of short period of time where the Soviets had their own version of that new, larger weapon, you see? So that is called an arms race, right? So it's kind of like, well, you've got a 1-inch firecracker, we're going to develop a 2-inch firecracker. And that's going to keep you from using your 1-inch firecracker, right? Then the other side gets their 2-inch firecracker. And then, so we have to develop a 3-inch firecracker, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And that is exactly what was happening during the 1950s. I mean, it was, if you know the history of this, I mean, it's literally insane. I mean, we were exploding these weapons out in the desert of like Nevada, and out in Pacific Islands, that made the bombs that we used in Japan in World War II, that made them look like these little firecrackers. Okay, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but not by much. All right, a thermonuclear weapon is exponentially larger in explosive force than the original weapons that we had that were nuclear bombs. And then, of course, the Russians kept developing their own, right? And the Russians had this thing where wherever we made, they wanted to make the one that they were copying. They had to make it a little bit bigger just to show us, right? And it became ridiculous. I mean, even the Soviet engineers who were being ordered to develop a new, bigger one than the one we had, the United States had, the Soviet engineers said, when is this going to stop? I mean, it's just ridiculous. We've already got a weapon here that'll crack the earth in half. I mean, to what degree do we have to increase the size of these things, right? And it reached the limit of people's credulity about what we were doing, and that was the whole Cold War in sort of that civil defense sort of way. I mean, when I was a kid, I'm in December 30th, I'll be 65 years old. So if you're up around my age, I mean, you'll remember maybe like I did. One of my favorite shows, maybe my favorite show was The Twilight Zone, and I used to watch this stuff, and it was always had something to do with, there was a nuclear exchange, and somebody comes crawling out of some basement somewhere, and he's the only one still left alive, and that's the thing, and every single thing was revolved around this Armageddon theme, and that was a whole period of time. It was a whole period of time, and we haven't really heard a lot about this nuclear stuff until just recently, where people were talking about, well, what's going to happen with, I mean, is Vladimir Putin going to use a tactical nuclear weapon, and what happens if that happens, and all the rest of this sort of thing, But for anybody who remembers all of this, we've been down this road before, and it's literally unthinkable. So I think I'll put a cap on it right there. I brought you up to pretty much the modern era. Next time we'll talk about the end of the Cold War, as we know it, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, the collapse of Soviet communism, America as the sole superpower, globalism in postmodern Russia, and contemporary relevance of the Cold War, which I've been threading through here as we've been going along anyway. Okay, guys?
Thank you again, Art, for that wonderful session about the Cold War. I was riveted about it. Does anyone have any questions for Art? You can unmute yourself, or you can type it in the chat.
All right.
Don't be shy.
Okay, well, if you've gotten, like I said, you can always follow up with an email or something like that. I'm always available. And a couple of you reached out with your emails, and I put you on my my mailing list as requested. If anybody else wants that, just let me know. I try never to be presumptuous about those things, because I always find it an intrusion when people, without having asked me, just put me on their mailing list. I always resent that, so I never want to do it to other people. All right. God bless you. I'll see you next week.
You can always email the library. I just want to take time to thank Art for his lectures. Our next session will be on November 30th at 2 p.m. and I will be sending out the email for when session 4 has been posted on YouTube, and then also an email with the next Zoom link that will be for the 30th. In the meantime, everyone enjoy your holidays. Thank you, Art, so much, and we'll see you all next time.
Bye.
Bye.